I am Linda van Tilburg for National Security News. The Tuareg rebels in Mali ambushed Russia's Wagner group, resulting in the deaths of several dozen fighters and Malian troops in the northeast region of the country. This incident is considered the largest loss for Russian forces since their expanded presence in Africa. To discuss the implications for Russia in the Sahel, I have Professor Sebastian Elischer, a political science expert at the University of Florida, with me. Welcome, Professor Elischer.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, can we discuss this incident? First of all, can we just go back on what happened?
So that's a great question. We do know that there has been an incident in northern Mali in which the Tuareg secessionist groups could kill and injure many members of the Malian armed forces and killed an estimated number of somewhere between 80 to 90 Wagner mercenaries. Wagner now being called Africa Corps in sub-Saharan Africa since the mysterious death of its former leader. Now, we have limited knowledge about what goes on in northern Mali, mainly because the military junta in Bamako tightly controls the media coverage. But from Twitter and from kind of somewhat reliable media and journalists that do have access to the regions, we know that Wagner probably experienced its first serious military loss in northern Mali because the Malian military government admitted as much in public statements just a few days ago. So we do know that after their initial success of taking back the northern Malian city of Kidal in November last year, there has now been a various setback resulting in a large number of casualties for Russian mercenaries, which is a first in the Sahel.
Well, what is the link between that group and Ukraine? Because there was a Ukrainian military official who hinted that they might have helped.
It now appears to be the case that Ukrainian military intelligence provided the Tuareg rebels with intelligence about the whereabouts of Wagner mercenaries in northern Mali, and apparently this occurred, or the Ukrainian military intelligence was able to do so by looking at intercepted telegram messages. It further appears now that there has been some kind of military training provided to the Tuareg rebels with regard to drone technology. If this was to be true, then that's odd. That's an odd strategy by Ukraine. I know that over the course of the last year or so, Ukraine has been rather keen on pushing its own narrative in sub-Saharan Africa through public diplomacy, through public speaking engagements, and the fact that the Ukrainian military intelligence is now basically admitting or is claiming that it helped the Tuareg secessionists is, on the Ukrainian side, probably bad PR. Because the Tuareg secessionists, of course, are the very same groups that in the past have fought Western military. The Tuareg secessionists, even though they have reasons, they have real grievances toward the Malian state, have committed atrocity in northern Mali. And it is well known that the Tuareg secessionists do have a kind of loose cooperation with some of the jihadi rebels that are also very active in northern and central Mali. And that's certainly bad PR for Ukraine. So to me, these are very surprising developments.
And the Malian government immediately cut all diplomatic ties with Ukraine when that came out.
Correct. And the more important implications now are twofold. So the first one concerns the Sahel region, or in more concrete terms, it concerns the foreign policy of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, all of which have condemned what Ukraine is doing. And I believe yesterday, Niger also ended its diplomatic relationships with Ukraine. And what the military governments in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey are now doing is they really use this in order to increase support for its collaboration with Russia. But more important, other West African countries that have pursued a pro-Western policy, for example, Senegal, now rightly are criticizing what Ukraine is doing, and that might have broader negative implications for Western, for European and American foreign policy in the region, and not just in the Sahel, in West Africa in general.
Well, and do you believe this defeat undermines the perception that security has improved for local communities with Wagner assistance to military juntas in the Sahel? Because a couple of the governments are using these forces.
Correct. So it certainly will. However, public perceptions in the north are not that, security is improving. I think it's the military governments and their propaganda channels that claim that security has improved. Just looking at some of the conflict data and looking at some of the media coverage on blogs of independent journalists, but also on Twitter, where Malian journalists are blogging, indicates clearly that since the juntas have come to power and since they have turned away from military cooperation with Western countries, the security situation either has remained as bad as it was before in some localities, or it has worsened significantly. Jihadi attacks across the 3 countries in the central Sahel are up. The Malian armed forces, as I said before, was able to retake Kidal in November last year, but this now appears to be a temporary triumph. So it will impact, or it might impact the ability of the junta to use those messages that they've been used before, saying that cooperation with Russia is a lot more effective than cooperation with France or the United States. But for local populations in northern Mali, I don't think it will make much of a difference, especially since for quite some time now there have been, I would say, well-founded speculations that Wagner mercenaries have committed atrocities against local populations, and much more so than the Malian armed forces. I don't think it will change all that much in local perceptions.
Well, Wagner doesn't come free. So what is the cost? What is the cost to these governments?
Right. So Wagner, or the Africa Corps, as it is known by now, is a private corporation that is now operating under the oversight of the Kremlin, but it is still a mercenary group, and it operates according to the same business model that Wagner had operated under. And it basically means you get soldiers and you get military training, and you pay for this either in cash or through economic concessions. So the growing report that Wagner is seeking access to gold mines in Mali through business middlemen, and there might be other sidekicks that we are not aware of, because Wagner is not a public entity and there is very little transparency on the side of the Kremlin with regard to what kind of goods Wagner is receiving. But all across the Sahel, Wagner is trying to get a hold of raw materials and minerals. So the kind of stuff that the Russian economy needs. And it's quite likely that the military juntas in the three capitals in the central Sahel are paying cash for heavy weaponry from Russia. So that has been a major criticism of the governments that these militaries have overthrown. And the criticism was that major Western countries such as France and the United States are not selling heavy weapons due to human rights considerations. And that has emerged as a kind of key criticism of governments all across Western Africa. And the claim here is dealing with Russia is just so much more effective. We can get heavy weapons in return for cash, and we need heavy weapons to fight the terrorists or to fight the secessionists. How exactly or what kind of business deals Wagner is involved in, we don't know for sure, but it's very likely that it has to do with access to gold and other raw materials in the region.
Well, could this setback that there was with Mali derail Russia's involvement in Africa?
I don't think so at the moment at all. I think that for Russia, this all comes at very low costs for two reasons. First of all, it's a mercenary group. So even though Wagner or the Africa Corps has moved a lot closer to the Kremlin, formally speaking, these are not Russian soldiers that are dying. These are Russian citizens for whom the Russian government will not claim responsibility. Second of all, there is no human rights lobby operating in Russia that can make this an issue. And Russian public interest in Africa is incredibly limited. So very different from sort of the UK, France, or the United States, where, you know, if 80 British soldiers or 80 American soldiers were killed in the Sahel, we would talk about nothing else for months on end. This is not going to happen in Russia. And I think Russia or the Africa Corps is getting a lot more out of these shady business deals than what this offsets in terms of the losses. So right now, I don't see any implications coming out of this. Having said this, should there be further military defeats? Should Mali or should private Malian businesses not pay Wagner? Or should the people who run Wagner realize over the long run this is not going to work out? They will abandon Mali, just how Wagner has abandoned other African governments. But this is not going to happen in the medium to near future, also because this kind of Russian engagement in the Sahel is a big PR thing for Russia. Russia needs this kind of panicky Western coverage about renewed Russian engagement in the Sahel and in West Africa, because it's a great PR victory. So for now, I don't think much will change. What might change is Wagner's military strategy in Mali. And the question is, what kind of conclusions will they draw on for the battlefield operations? So we might see different military strategies, but we are not going to see a withdrawal of Mali from the Sahel anytime soon.
So the West has been retreating from that area. I mean, the U.S. Armed forces have been basically thrown out of Niger, and the French. So what should the West policy be towards that region?
So I think for now, the military juntas have made it very clear that they either don't want large-scale Western involvement, or they want to prioritize military cooperation with non-Western powers, and that's something that ought to be accepted. And I think what Western countries should do is they should continue humanitarian aid. They should continue development aid as instructed by those governments that are in power. But what Western governments should do is they should continue to seek dialogue with these regimes, because the military juntas will not be forever. Ultimately, they will run out of legitimacy, and ultimately they will recognize that they are just as capable or just as incapable as their civilian counterparts in resolving those security crises. And these military juntas will fall by the wayside in the medium to long-term run. And then, the political deck will be redesigned again, and it will be important for Western powers to be present on the ground. So I do think for now the West should try and continue a constructive dialogue. And the West will need to do that if it wants to exercise influence in the central Sahel and beyond. This kind of withdrawal, not recognizing the government of Niger, so which is current French line in Niger, for example, that's not a very constructive approach.
And there's, of course, this that you mentioned, that the West doesn't want to supply the weapons that these governments want. So, how do they manage that?
So this will not be an option, mainly because there are legal restrictions. For example, here in the United States, so the second there has been an unconstitutional handover of power, the United States by law is not allowed to engage in security sector assistance, and there will be similar restrictions in place in other countries. There are ways how Western countries, so how the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom can try and help improve security in conflict-affected areas. But again, that's not what the military juntas want. And I think there would be a real risk of being exposed if the West imposed or tried to push sort of Western security personnel onto these areas. But right now, that's not an option anyway, because that's not what these governments want, and that ought to be respected.
Well, Professor Elischer from the University of Florida, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you so much for having me.